Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and we're here today with Angus Fletcher, who is a professor of story science, right, at The Ohio State University, at this thing called the Project Narrative, and also the author of a bunch of books. Most recent book is this one called Primal Intelligence. You are smarter than you know, which builds on some previous work. I think it builds on this one, Storythinking, which I think it's a work of philosophy more than anything else. Maybe we can talk about the overlaps between story science and philosophy. And this was preceded by Wonderworks, Literary Invention and the Science of Stories. And somewhere in there, you managed to crank out this thing called Creative Thinking, which is a field guide for, I guess, operators, military operators, and it's got the military font in here. So welcome, Angus.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing my entire library. You've got more of my books than I do.
Well, the thing is, I was just saying before the podcast started that I would not have predicted the direction that you went from Wonderworks, which is a fantastic book. And I guess your training was in literature, and now I think you're almost like a leadership coach or something. And you've worked a lot with these folks in the military on how to improve their decision-making, their leadership, and so forth. And so, we have to, of course, talk about how that happened. But I think the core of your work is really about, I guess, rehabilitating mythos, right? So, the Greeks thought of logos and mythos as sort of equally valid, equally important ways for us to understand the world. And I guess over time, right, mythos has kind of been pushed to the background, right? And logos has come to the front. And, a perfect example of this would be, Danny Kahneman's work, right, which I spend a lot of my time on, right, where System 1 and System 2. And of course, it's caricature. There's a little bit of a caricature there. I mean, he's not saying that System 1 is unimportant, but he sort of says that System 2 ought to be in the driver's seat, right? And I think you are presenting a much richer view of what we might call System 1. It's not simply about emotion, right? But it's about so much more. So to what extent is what you're doing I guess a radical departure? I mean, it seems like you're trying to establish an entirely new, weighting scheme for what it is that we do in universities and in life.
Yeah, well, it's only new from the perspective of the present. I would actually say that it's what humans have been doing for almost our entire evolutionary history. To your point about Kahneman, Danny Kahneman's obviously was a very brilliant mind. I talked about it at the beginning of Primal Intelligence, and yes, I pivot hard away from what he does. So maybe the big background on me is I actually started out in neurophysiology. I started out in neuroscience. And at the time that I was working in neuroscience, people had this view, which really emerged in the mid-20th century, that the brain was a computer. It was a sense-making apparatus. It just took in huge amounts of information, and it used that information to make, intelligent decisions. And maybe it had a bunch of heuristics, like emotion or whatever, that helped to come to snap decisions when it had limited amounts of information. But for the most part, it was aiming to go this System 2 route of accumulating as much information as possible and delaying decision-making until it had achieved, enough to think confidently. And I just did not see that as being in any way consonant with the way that the brain was actually operating. And, just very simply, working in a neurophysiology lab, the most basic thing you learn about a neuron is it doesn't work like a transistor. It doesn't work like a piece of computer equipment. The main difference is that what a neuron does naturally is initiate action. So if you just put a neuron in a jar with no inputs whatsoever, no data coming in, it will just start initiating actions. It'll start doing things. You notice this when you look at a kid, right? A kid doesn't need to have a lot of information or a lot of input. They just are restless. They start doing things. Your brain naturally is restless. It creates this thing which has been vilified in the modern world known as anxiety. But all of this restlessness, all this initiating action is actually the basis of human intelligence. It's the complete opposite of the way the computers work. And when you string a bunch of new actions together, what do you get? You get a story, you get a narrative, you get a plot. And so from the beginning of my career, I became obsessed with, to use your term, mythos, or the idea that basically narrative is as intelligent, if not more intelligent in terms of practical life than logos, which is to say logic. And so since then, I've gone on this big odyssey, which has ultimately ended with me working with U.S. Army Special Operations over the last couple of years.
Well, I mean, I think that the thing that you think narrative thinking, I mean, we'll dig into, there's narrative cognition, story thinking, there's a bunch of different terms that you have. But it seems to me that what you're focused on is causal reasoning and kind of, what if thinking or, imagination. And it seems like those things, which are integral to everything we do, those things require this different way of thinking, right? I mean, and they're deeply connected. So when you're trying to think about causes, you're doing so primarily because you're interested in doing some kind of intervention or action going forward, right? So you're looking for the way of making sense of the past so that you can take actions in the future.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, the simple way to think about this from a narrative perspective is that what we're taught in school is that stories go beginning, middle, end. But actually, in your brain, they go middle, beginning, end. And why is that? Well, because it's you go around the world and you encounter a surprise, and the surprise makes you realize I've entered into the middle of a story that I don't know. A chain of events that doesn't fit with my current world narrative is something that I've stumbled into. So the first question that your brain asks is, where did this come from? What's the beginning? Which is why, which is causal reasoning. And then once you've come up with a possible cause, you then jump forward into the future, which is to say you imagine the end of the story and you say, what if? What can I do with this? And the backward jump, the causal jump, causal thinking, is the basis of science. And the what if jump, the forward jump, is the basis of technology. And so this is the kind of low information process that is constantly running in the human brain that computers can't do, that AI can't do. And that's sort of become the focus of my research. And in particular, I've become really interested in working with doctors and engineers and soldiers and astronauts and other individuals who are in these environments that are constantly changing to help them speed up those processes and make them more effective.
Well, I mean, you're not making the case that this is illogical, right? Or contrary to logic, are you? I mean, it's supplements. It's an alternative, right?
It's an alternative, yeah. So it's like saying, is a saw contrary to a hammer? No, they're different mechanisms of intelligence. And the human brain actually has a lot of computational mechanisms of intelligence in it. The best example of this is the visual cortex, which is a huge sense-making apparatus, which takes on a huge amount of data, integrates it by using essentially and or not operations, detects patterns just like a computer does, so on and so forth. But the visual cortex operates very differently from, say, the motor cortex, which is what's responsible for initiating action and sort of understanding, how the movements of the world around us are indicating certain rules or laws of our environment. And so what's really important to understand about the human brain is it's basically like a Swiss Army knife of technologies. There are all these different mechanisms in there. And our modern school system and our modern ways of thinking have focused exclusively on the computational areas of the brain. And as a result, we've done this weird thing where we've sort of turned ourselves into second-class algorithms, which is, these parts of the brain are actually not as powerful in us as they are in computers. And so we become obsessed in training them up, but we're never going to get as good at them as computers are. And yet we built these school systems and these businesses which are trying to turn humans into little computers while neglecting all the other parts of our brain that do things that computers can. And so a lot of my focus is just, let's start to focus on these other parts of the brain that we don't have technologies that can replace yet.
Well, I mean, I think we as educators know that we can make people better at logical reasoning, right? Through training, right? Through practice. But I think you're making the case that you can become better at story thinking, right?
Yeah.
That this also is, it's not just this thing that you come out of the womb doing, right? I mean, you do, but you don't come out of it doing as well as you could. So what does it mean to do better story thinking versus kind of worse or, less well-developed story thinking?
Yeah, so I'll give you the kind of the high level, and then we can maybe talk through, if you want, some of the specific communities I work with. So on a high level, we talked about how story thinking involves, first of all, causal thinking, and then second of all, involves what if or counterfactual thinking. So what you want to do with causal thinking is you want to start diversifying the number of whys. You want to start coming up with more explanations for why something could happen. Because the more you get locked into a single explanation, which is what happens with most people, when something goes wrong, they go right back to the same cause. This is a problem with most relationships. You're like, oh, I know why this person is doing this, and as a result, you're never able to deepen or grow that relationship. And so being able to come up with more explanations for why things happen, and be able to do it faster and faster and faster, that's the first step in improving your story thinking, your narrative cognition. And the second,
well, and that's a type of perspective taking, right?
Yeah. So one of the most effective ways to do that is through perspective taking. So imagining how might somebody else explain this is a very fast way to kind of get at that. And that's a really good way of doing it. And that's why theater and a lot of these sort of early kind of cultural practices are so significant in kind of launching effective communities, I guess I would say. Then the other part of the process is sharpening your counterfactual thinking. And what that means is basically a lot of people will say, well, I want to get to this endpoint. And so I'm just going to, for example, my students, like, I want to get a great job. So I'm just going to go to school. And then if I go to school, then I'm going to get this great job. And you're not filling in the thousands of intermediate steps go between going to school and getting that job. And by sharpening your counterfactual thinking, what you're starting to do is fill in every single individual step that might be required. You're coming up with a more precise plan. And this is the same thing that happens if you get hired to work as a TV writer, is you get told, hey, here's where last season ended. Here's where this season is going to end. You've got to fill in all the intermediate steps, and you've got to make them plausible enough that an audience is going to follow along. And so these are all techniques that we can learn to do. TV now, I think, is much more precise than it was 25, 50 years ago. TV writers get better over the course of their careers at doing this. In the same way, I work with a lot of special operations units, and they get better at diversifying their causal thinking in the sense that they get better at going into other communities and coming up with alternate explanations as to why things happen. And so, so too to good scientists.
Well, what's the role of literature here? I mean, it seems like literature can help you, right? Consuming a wide range of literature. I mean, virtually all of your heroes in the book, at least all the ones that have been around for the last 500 years, read Shakespeare, right? So, I mean, it's not just, I presumably reading comic books and other genre fiction, it helps to some degree, but maybe not quite as much as reading, really good literature.
Well, the most important thing is just that you're reading stories that challenge you. And so if you're the kind of person who spends all your day reading Shakespeare, it's actually probably better for you to take a break and read a comic book. If you're the kind of person who spends all your day reading comic books, it's probably better to take a break and read Shakespeare. The important thing to realize is that we're teaching kids literature wrong in schools. And this has started occurring since really the early 20th century. People now think that the purpose of literature is to read a book and identify what it means, what the message is, what the moral, what it's saying. And another term for that is interpretation. People think that the purpose of reading is to interpret. Interpret is actually a logic function. If you go back to the early 20th century and you read guys like I.A. Richards, they're very explicit about this. They believe in this kind of computational approach to reading literature. They have all sorts of reasons for wanting to do it, but that has basically become the dominant way that we read literature now. It's the same way they read literature in the Middle Ages. And what it does is it essentially turns literature into a form of propaganda. The idea is that this book is trying to convince you of some political opinion or some social opinion or something else. Actually, the function of literature is to increase your imagination. And we know that because the first thing that happens when you're a kid and you start reading books is you start imagining stuff. You start imagining yourself as different characters. You start imagining yourself in different worlds. That's the entire point of literature, is to grow your ability to imagine new stories. And because a new story is a new plot, is a new plan, the sort of primordial purpose of reading literature is to grow your ability to make new plans. And that's why, to your point, if you look at people who are successful innovators, successful scientists, whether it's Nikola Tesla, whether it's Steve Jobs, whether it's Marie Curie, whether it's Vincent van Gogh, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, all of them credited Shakespeare for increasing their imagination. And so one of the things that I'm just relentless about when I work with individuals, including special operators, so I make read Hamlet, or doctors or entrepreneurs, or whatever, is I say you've got to read works that stimulate your imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just about 2-3 years ago, I had this sort of aha moment when because I'm trying to figure out like what it is exactly that I do for a living. And I realized that, I'm just a glorified storyteller, right? Because, I'm thinking, well, no, I'm teaching finance, I'm teaching management, I'm teaching statistics, but really all I'm doing is telling a bunch of stories because, if it were just the concepts, they could read the book and they wouldn't need me.
Yeah, but see, what's key is that when you tell someone a story effectively, it allows them to imagine themselves in that position. And then what they do in that position is they imagine, what could I do? And when that's done effectively, what it allows them to do is imagine alternatives not just alternatives from what they themselves are doing in their own lives, but alternatives to what the individuals did in that situation. So when I got into, so when I started going into business schools, because after I started working in the Army, I got invited to work at a bunch of business schools. And I discovered they do a bunch of these things called case studies. And I also discovered that they teach case studies really badly. Like what they do is they'll give you this incredibly elaborate case study, something. And then they'll ask the students, hey, what would you do in this situation? And then the students will say something. And if the students say something other than what the original person in the case study did, the teacher will say, that's wrong. That's wrong. What you should have done is you should have done exactly, what Steve Jobs did when he did the iPhone or whatever. Yeah. And that's the least helpful way to teach. Actually, what you want to say as the teacher is, okay, that's interesting. Why did you say that? What would your next step be? And then you want to start saying, okay, well, as a result of you doing that, here's what happened in the market. How would you respond to that? And then you start getting them to engage in the story, sort of like a choose your own adventure would be one way of thinking about it. So they start to develop their ability to operate in that space and basically role play, as opposed to treating the case study as English departments now treat Shakespeare, which is as a source of a lesson. And that you learn the lesson, and that somehow by learning the lesson, just like a medieval literary critic, you engage the truth of the story and therefore don't need to actually read the story.
Right. So like in that diagram you have that repeats itself in the book all the time, right? You're sitting at the middle and you're looking backward to try to figure out how you got to where you were, and there's really only, there's a single path that got you there. And then to sort of imagine all of the different paths that could potentially fork out from where you are, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the military has this great phrase for this, which is plan or not the plan. And the basic idea here is that you want to teach people to make plans. And that's because plans are what, win the day. But the rule of plans is that no plan survives contact with reality. Because reality is influenced by your plan, reality is different from you imagined, and so on and so forth.
Mike Tyson has a more colorful version of that.
Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Exactly, yeah. And so, the point is you want to teach planners. But how do you teach planners? Well, the way that happens in school is you get taught, well, there's a right plan for every situation. And the moment that happens, actually, you don't become a good planner. You become someone who thinks that they have to find the right plan, and that inhibits your imagination. Whereas if school instead teaches you, hey, what would you do in this situation? Okay, that was a good plan. Here's why it didn't work. Try it again. And you start realizing that because I made a plan in the past, I can make a plan in the future. And the purpose of planning is to develop my ability at planning, as opposed to come up with a perfect plan that I stick with. Then you can start to see school as an environment to practice and train up these abilities, as opposed to a place to come up with the right plan that is somehow magically supposed to work. And the one thing we just know is that there is no right plan, and it's certainly not to be found in the past. And your professor certainly does not have it, because if your professor had it, they wouldn't be professing. They would be rich somewhere on an island.
Yeah, I want to dig into this view of literature, right? Because it does seem, and I've spoken to a number of other people on the podcast, right, that if the purpose of literature is to make some kind of statement around society or make, have some kind of message. There seem like other ways of doing that that are, better designed for that. And so this notion that literature is doing something very different. I mean, it's still a technology. I mean, you refer to it as a technology. So as a technology, what is it doing, right? And why do we have it? And this whole school, I didn't know about Carl Lockman and Ronald Crane. I mean, I thought I knew a lot of critics, but I think the new critics and they're critics of the new critics and all of them. But it seems like this whole separate strand of literary criticism, most of us never hear about it.
Yeah, so Crash Course in the History of 20th Century Literary Criticism. Basically, I.A. Richards, who I've already mentioned, in the early 20th century, he becomes the basis for something known as New Criticism, which essentially still dominates English departments today, even though they've reacted against it in various ways. And what New Criticism basically says is that literature is made up of words, and you interpret those words to determine what they mean. And that means you're trying to figure out the message of the literature. And then in the mid-20th century, in like 1960s, 1970s, there was a counter-revolution against New Criticism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, all this kind of stuff that basically was like, literature doesn't mean anything. And so basically, if you go into an English department now, you're either confronted by a new critic who thinks that if you read closely, you'll figure out exactly what the work means, or you will meet someone who is essentially a form of a linguistic relativist who's like, it can mean anything that you want it to mean.
Well, hold on. I think they'll still say that it is doing something to the reader, right? But it's primarily leading them to believe certain things,
It's leading them to believe certain things. And in the case of the new critic, it's leading you to believe in a certain kind of logical conclusion. In the case of the kind of the post-structuralist, it's leading you to believe that, logic is broken and, all of us have this kind of radical subjectivity and autonomy is the kind of primary source of ethics or something like that. What most people don't know is that there's an alternative to this argument, which emerges in the 1950s, which is a group of scholars who you just mentioned called the Chicago School. They emerged in the 1950s at the University of Chicago, led by someone called R.S. Crane. And they were instead interested in this idea that, no, literature is not made up of words. And the purpose of literature is not to interpret it. Instead, literature is made up of narratives. And the purpose of reading literature is to engage with those narratives and have experiences. And as the model for this, they went back to something called Aristotle's Poetics, which was written about 350 BC. And Aristotle does this two kind of like mind-blowing things in the Poetics. First of all, he points out that when people go to experience tragedies, they experience catharsis. And that's another way of saying that they go and they process a lot of their grief. And, this has been a long question. It's like, why would people go see sad stories, right? It's your day off. It's your vacation. Why would you go watch something terrible happening to somebody else? And there have been a bunch of sort of weird explanations for this.
Yeah, you feel like you got hit by a truck, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, why would you do that? Why would you bum yourself out, So there have been explanations like Schadenfreude and things like that. But Aristotle's explanation is, no, actually, we've all had this experience of listening to something sad and then getting in touch with our own sort of suppressed memories of grief and starting to process them and starting to become more emotionally whole as a result of going through that. And so Aristotle points out, I think really brilliantly, that one of the main things that happens when you read a literary story is you process your emotions, you process your negative emotions. And then the other thing he points out is that literature is a source of what he calls wonder, which is actually the primary source of what we would call now a self-transcendent experience or spiritual experience, which goes beyond just kind of mental health into mental well-being and the sense of, oh, now I feel like there's a reason that I'm alive. Like I feel in contact with something bigger than myself. And that sense of greater purpose, of greater direction, which allows you to flourish in life as opposed to just kind of get by. So Aristotle basically points out these two benefits. And sort of what I've done in my research is say, with these two benefits, starting with processing negative things and then also giving us access to positive experiences, can be radically expanded. And so we can find all sorts of negative experiences that literature can help us process, including various types of trauma and whatnot. And it can also give us all sorts of very positive experiences, including, creativity and more energy, more empathy, more curiosity, all these kinds of things. And so that's kind of what the Chicago School started in the middle of the 20th century. That's kind of what my lab and my team here at Project Narrative have continued doing. And so we really see literature as a technology of getting more out of your brain in the sense of helping troubleshoot the parts of your brain that aren't performing as well as you want, and then sort of adding, these kinds of positive, effective experiences that help you perform better in the future.
Well, I think you had another phrase. I mean, you said it sort of helps solve the problem of surviving yourself, right? I mean,
yes.
And so, psychiatry and self-help, right, seems to have replaced not only religion, but literature. And, maybe religion is a form of literature at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, well, and I would just be honest and say I think psychiatry is doing a pretty poor job of it right now. And if you think about, so I just work in the special operations community, and so I work with a lot of soldiers who have post-traumatic stress. And so if you go into that community, what are the two major remedies that psychiatrists give them? The first is some form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which usually involves things like mindfulness and meditation and whatnot. And that's incredibly ineffective. Mostly what it does is it interrupts negative experiences, which can be helpful as a kind of a short-term coping mechanism, a way of managing a kind of surge of anxiety or some other thing. But it doesn't help you then transition out of interrupting that negative experience to actually having a positive experience. And then the other thing that they, of course, do is lots of medication. And this is a misuse, I think, of medication. I mean, medication is really there for triage. It's really there to stop you if you're experiencing suicidal ideation or something that's really getting in the way of you being able to function. But at the end of the day, you have to go in there and do the work to turn your own brain around. There isn't medication out there that's going to help you develop these kinds of, positive forms of healing. The body always heals itself is another way of saying this. Medicine can go in there and stop the body from dying, and it's great at doing that. It's great at having these triage interventions, but you yourself have to do the work of getting healthy. Right. And so psychiatry has in various ways sort of let us down, and literature, as I have use this relentlessly with the special operators. I mean, one of the kind of things that you deal with in the special operations community is not just high levels of suicidal ideation and hopelessness and despair, but huge amounts of marital dysfunction. The divorce rates in a lot of these units I work in are close to 90%. And we've been able to go in and show that you use these techniques from literature, from Shakespeare, from Hamlet, and it radically improves the quality of your marriage. It radically improves your outlook on life. It radically improves your interactions with other people. And so it's just a huge resource that we're not making use of. It doesn't displace or replace modern psychiatry, but it's just to acknowledge that modern psychiatry is not giving us all the things we need right now. And there's this just kind of, great potential in our libraries that is going neglected.
Yeah, and we got to imagine that all the people who are sitting in the audience of, Aeschylus or Sophocles, I mean, they will have all been in battle at some point and have seen a lot of death and destruction, right? Stuff that we can only imagine, most of us, in our comfortable lives.
That's right. I mean, a lot of Greek tragedy is written by veterans for veterans is another way of saying that. And I was actually very honored before I did a lot of the work in my own research when I was a very kind of a young scholar. I was honored. Someone called Peter Meinik, he's a professor at NYU. He invited me out. He got $1 million grant from the NEH to stage Greek tragedies for veterans. And I was very skeptical about this initially. I was like, what? This seems like a very odd form of intervention. Are these tragedies going to work? And actually, it had a tremendous and immediate effect on these veterans. They would stand up during the performances. They would start weeping. They would start having these conversations with their families. And that's because what's really happening there is these stories are accessing your story. And a huge part of PTS, post-traumatic stress, and these other kinds of traumatic events are buried experiences of shame and grief that you haven't figured out how to integrate into your life story. And so you just keep pushing them down. But once you start to realize, oh, here's a way that I can start talking about these things. Here's a way I can start integrating them with my own narrative. They then shift from being things that are interrupting your normal brain function to sources of wisdom and strength. And they develop what I talk about in the book as a kind of anti-fragility. And one of the great things that I've been able to experience is that when you work with operators and you help them process their experiences of combat, they actually become much, much stronger as a result of talking them through. And they don't need the medications anymore. They don't need any of that kind of stuff anymore. And they become a great support to the people in their lives because they've kind of discovered in their own way how that negative effect actually has a purpose going forward in their life.
Well, you talk about serious things like that, but you also talk about things that maybe are a little bit less significant, like how to turn salesmen into better salesmen, right?
I do.
and you have techniques for that too. Maybe you could dig into that, right? This very simple intervention, because while it's small and maybe not terribly important in the grand scheme of things, I think it sort of illustrates, right, these themes that you're talking about.
No, I actually think this is very important. I've learned an enormous amount working with salespeople. I actually think that being a salesperson is as close as you can become in a business environment to being a special operator. You're basically thrown out there. It's incredibly psychologically stressful. The number of salespeople I talk to who struggle with addiction or, alcohol abuse and things like that, because they're really feeling this enormous emotional churn, this huge amount of internal stress and anxiety.
Death of a salesman, right?
Death of a salesman. No, exactly. Yeah. So I think sales is very serious business. I really do. And of course, that dysfunction translates into all areas of their lives and challenges their relationship with their spouses and the rest of it. So yeah, so what I talk about in the book, which I think you're referring to, is this moment where I was given all of these salespeople who were sort of in their 40s and 50s and had been incredibly successful salespeople early in their careers, and were just now totally like burnt out and failing. And they were sent to me, and the question was like, how do you reactivate their ability to be great salespeople? And so what we did is we ran them through the same process that actually we run special operators through in their training. And what that ability is the ability to spot what's exceptional about people you meet. And the backstory behind this is that this power is what is known as intuition. And this way of thinking about intuition is the exact opposite of how Danny Kahneman thinks about intuition. Intuition for Kahneman is pattern matching. So it's about seeing something repeat over time. Whereas from this special operations perspective, intuition is spotting the exception to a rule. It's spotting the thing that actually doesn't fit into a pattern. And special operators are obsessed with this because the thing that doesn't fit into the rule is the first sign of an emergent opportunity or an emergent threat. And so the better you can train your brain at identifying these exceptions, the more able you are to react in a combat situation when there's a chance for you to win the battle or when something alarming is emerging and you need to change your plan. And what I found fascinating about this is that certain operators are better at intuition than others. But over time, you can train up all operators to have higher levels of intuition. And what I also found fascinating is that young children have very high levels of intuition, and that the more successful you are in business, usually the lower your intuition is. And that's because you get more in the habit of productivity, efficiency, pattern matching. And so anytime you find something that's an exception to a rule, you dismiss it. You say, oh, you know what? That's the exception that proves the rule, or you regress it to the mean. And this is what computers do. Computers skip over exceptions. They're unable to see them. They're unable to process them because they can only think in patterns. And so the real question is, like, how do you reactivate this childhood part of your intelligence? Not that you want it on all the time, right? If you go around your entire life just looking at exceptions, it's very inefficient, but you might need to turn it on in certain moments. For example, if you're a salesperson and you're meeting with a new client and you're trying to figure out what is special and unique about this client so that I can make a tight bond with them and connect them to some unique aspect of the things that I'm selling. How do I build that trust, that sense in the person that I'm really listening to them and hearing what's special and unique about them? And so what we found is there's a lot of good ways to kind of turn on this ability. The most basic is just travel. So the more you travel, the more you surround yourself with different environments that are exceptions, to your lived environment. I think all of us have had this experience. You go travel in another part of the world, you come back to your life and you see it with fresh eyes. Art, literature, these are also really good at spotting exceptions. But the exercise that we do with the salespeople, which is really simple, which anyone can do, is you have a conversation with someone and you do not allow yourself to ask why. When you're having that conversation, you're allowed to ask who, what, when, where, how, but never why. So you might be talking about how they, went this week on a bike trip, and you might say, oh, where did you go, and who did you go with, and who was the first person you went biking with, and so on and so forth. And eventually, over the course of this conversation, something will come up that will make you want to ask why. Like they might say, well, one person I never go biking with is my spouse. And immediately be like, well, why? Like, why don't you go say? Yeah. But you can't ask that, right? Instead, you've got to say, oh, well, what else do you do with your spouse? And does your spouse ever go biking with somebody else and things like that? You see what I mean? And then when you start doing this, you start surfacing information beneath the surprise. And what that allows you to do is, instead of jumping to a judgment, which is essentially what why forces, it forces either you or the other person to make a judgment, you start bringing up more things in which there might be more exceptions, more exceptional information. And we find that with really effective military interrogators, not to get creepy, they almost never ask why. They just ask more of these other questions, and the more surprised they are, the less surprised they act, and the more they ask these questions. And same thing with effective salespeople. They almost never ask why. And so with those salespeople who are all burnt out, we just forced them to do this exercise for 5 minutes. That was all we forced them to do. And then we sent them back to their jobs, and a surprising number of them immediately became significantly more effective because they were put back in touch with their intuition, their ability to see what was exceptional about their clients.
Well, I'm going to violate what you just told me not to do. And I'm going to ask you, why, or, why do you think, right? What do you think is going on here? I mean, is it that once you come up with an explanation, it immediately sort of shuts down further inquiry? It's like, okay, I can tie a ribbon and a bow on that thing and, stick it into my framework in a nice little box and then stop thinking?
Judgment is the end of curiosity. The moment you make a judgment, your curiosity ends. And what you do is you then say, this is, why this is happening, and I'm not going to accelerate this protocol. I'm going to shift into efficiency and productivity and power this ahead. And again, that's how adults operate. Adults are always looking as fast as possible for why. That's why adults, if they don't know something, they immediately go to Google, or now they go to AI, right? Because I got to find why as fast as possible. And that's why children actually suspend themselves in a state, which is what allows them to grow. Or at least it did before children were now given technology at a young age, which is now sort of hampering their ability to develop this. But yeah, to your point, there's nothing wrong with why. It just means you're shifting into an efficiency cycle as opposed to a discovery cycle. And the question you always want to be asking yourself as a person, whether you're a salesperson or not, is, am I in discovery mode or am I in efficiency mode? If you're in efficiency mode, then what that's saying is my environment is basically the same as it was yesterday. The protocols that I developed yesterday should be working today. Let's power ahead with them. Let's max out the gains that are here to be had. But if you're in discovery mode, what you're saying is actually things are changing. If I accelerate, I'm going to get into trouble because what I did yesterday is not going to work particularly effectively today. I've got to learn more. I've got to develop new protocols. I've got to test and experiment with those until I find one that works. And then I can shift back into efficiency mode and start to accelerate again.
Right. And of course, AI is all about pattern recognition, right? So
Yeah.
AI is really, really good at spotting the norm, right?
Yeah.
Understanding how things fit. And so, are you saying that humans are particularly good at, I guess, understanding things that are out of sample?
Yeah, I mean, that's our edge. So, I mean, this is the whole thing about AI, is it's really, really good when today is the same as yesterday, when there's an off-the-shelf answer. And that's why AI is the king of warehouses. That's why, Amazon uses AI so much, is because these are incredibly stable environments where, every box is where you left it yesterday and so on and so forth. But the human brain evolved in incredibly volatile environments where there was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of unknowns. And also, any business environment is inherently volatile because it's a competitive space. It's essentially another version of war. You're at war with your competitors. You're trying to destroy their edge. They're trying to destroy your edge. And so the real problem I think we're seeing now with this sort of overvaluation of AI is really only good at operationalizing stable and very transparent domains. And those domains, as we see looking around the modern world, are becoming less and less and less and less and less. And more, what we need is this human ability to be able to lead, to take the initiative, to imagine in the unknown. And unfortunately, because we're spending so much time with technology, we're getting worse and worse and worse and worse at doing that. And so we're in this really difficult moment right now, I think, where we've lost a lot of the skills that really make us human. We're relying more and more on AI, but that's pulling us into a trap where ultimately, chaos and volatility are only going to increase, because the way to produce a new norm, a new order, is actually to lean into initiative, to lean into intuition and imagination and these human low information processes.
Well, I think you quoted one of these special operations recruiters who said something, and maybe it was anecdotal, I don't know if there was data behind it, but that the candidates are getting smarter and smarter. Right. In other words, they're scoring higher on these tests and have higher IQs and so forth, but their practical capacities are suffering. Right? Like, you throw them in an environment and they're less capable of figuring out kind of what to do. Right.
There's a ton of data on this. So first of all, I think the quote is these kids can solve math problems, they can't solve life problems. And the main point there is that these kids are getting better and better and better standardized tests at picking the right answer from a list, but they have no idea what to do when confronted with an open-ended problem that doesn't have a right answer to it. And I think this isn't just special operations. I would say if you ask almost any employer now, the real frustration they have with young people is young people lack initiative. Young people are really, really great if you give them a problem that is incredibly defined and that the young person has solved before, right? They can immediately come up with it. Young people are getting incredibly good at school, and they're getting incredibly bad at life. And really what's happening is AI is revealing this, because AI is able to hack school. Right? AI is able to do all the things we're asking students to do, yet AI is actually pretty useless at having initiative and any of these other kinds of things. And so what this is pointing to is, we need to do what special operations started to do 20 years ago, which is start to redesign school. We need to stop having standardized testing, or at least so much of it. We need to stop having this idea that there are right answers. Because the more that a student thinks there's a right answer, the less likely they are to venture a new answer. Instead, they become, dependent, submissive, whatever. We need to start having open-ended problems that the teacher does not themselves know the answer to. And going back to what we were saying earlier, this is the whole point of a case study in like a business school classroom, is you put a case study out there and there isn't a right answer to it. And the moment the teacher pretends like there is a right answer to it, you just ruin the case study and you stop the students from learning how to be a leader themselves.
Well, yeah. I mean, my students now increasingly, they want to see sample answers. They want to see, show me an example of a really good one, that kind of
That's
thing.
right. Yeah.
And I have to resist the temptation to just give them what they want.
So we have this new training that we do. So I have this totally weird background, which we talked a little bit about. I started in neurophysiology. I worked in literature for a long time. I've now recently been appointed the head of the leadership initiative at our business school here at Ohio State. And a big part of what we're doing is we're developing this new training. And
it's got to be the only English PhD in that role. Any yes. business school in the country, right?
I think that's definitely the case. Yeah. What we're doing is we're building these classes in which the purpose is to provide controlled experiences of failure. And the way that we do that is we give students open-ended problems to which there isn't a right answer. And then whatever answer they give us, we explain to them, we say, hey, here's why that didn't work. Give us another plan. Try again. And what we're trying to do in that situation is teach them to understand what's going on in their brain when they're failing, and then how to coach themselves out of the failures. And so one of the ways we say this to students is we say, hey, leadership is by definition taking the first step. So every leader is on some level original. So there's no right way to teach you how to be a leader. However, most leaders fail in common ways. And we're going to identify the 4 most common brain failures, help you experience them through this training, and then figure out how to coach yourself out of them. And so this is all based on the special operations stuff, but the 4 common failures we always identify are failure of initiative, failure of emotional confidence, failure of imagination, and failure of strategic vision. And what those are really simply is failure of initiative is you can't come up with a plan. Failure of emotional confidence is you got a plan, but you don't have the confidence to try it. Failure of imagination is you come up with a plan, but only one plan, and you keep trying to force it again and again and again, even though it's not working. And then failure of strategic vision is you come up with a lot of plans, but they're not pointed in any overall direction. So you're basically just going round and round and round in circles, putting out fires, but never building a new building. And so what we do is we have a class where we run students through this and they learn and they say, oh, you know what? I'm having a failure of imagination right now. Or I'm having a failure of strategic vision, or I'm having a failure of initiative. And they start to learn, they understand why these processes are happening in their brain, and they learn how to coach themselves out of it. And as a result, we're able to release them into internships or whatever, and they are much more effective because instead of thinking, I need to be told exactly what to do, they just go and go and go until they experience a failure, they coach themselves out of the failure, and then they start going again.
Well, I think you said somewhere that a plan is a plot.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
And so all of those are things that happen in different stories, right?
That's right. A plan, another word for a plan is a plot, is a story. And when you look at the brain regions that go active in leaders, it's the exact same brain regions that go active in storytellers and that go active in screenwriters. And the reason for that is, what is a leader doing? A leader is telling a story of the future. And you'll experience this when you ever have an effective leader. They'll come into the room and they'll say, here's what I think we could be doing in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. And then what good leaders do is, after they tell that story of the future, they then start to fill in the little parts of the story, just like a TV screenwriter does, and say, hey, you're going to do these parts of the story. And they turn to someone else and you're going to do that part of the story. And then over time, that story starts to come true. That's why early in my career,
But they have, right, I think you said, defined strategy and undefined tactics, right?
That's right. That's right. So yeah. So this is another kind of special operations thing. So basically the question is like, what makes a good plan, or what makes a good leader? And to your point, it's having a defined strategy and unlimited tactics. And what that means is that you're able to pick where you're going in the long run, but you're able to imagine many different paths to get there. And the reason that that's important is that when you interview most CEOs today, and I did a lot of research on this and I was stunned by this, most CEOs have actually the opposite approach. They have many, many different places they're trying to go at the same time. So I worked with this one CEO of a Fortune 25 company, which will remain nameless. Well, they gave me a list of 15 objectives that they had to hit this year. And the moment you're trying to do 15 things at the same time, you're basically doing nothing. And so the first thing the special operations always does is say, clarify your overall strategic objective, define it. And then they say, once you've defined that, open yourself up to get there however you can, have that huge imaginative flexibility in the middle. And that's, again, where most people fail, because most people keep trying to climb all these different mountains using the same technique. They're always trying to do the same thing everywhere they go.
Yeah, I recently was asked to give a speech at a friend's wedding, and they're both sort of in the business startup world and so forth. So I said, to have a good marriage is like to have a good startup, right? You have to have a pretty clear vision of the solution you're targeting, but you have to be incredibly flexible when it comes to how you're going to get there. So it's really about a personality trait of, strong confidence and almost irrational desire to pursue something, but insane humility when it comes to how you're going to get there.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And that's just how life works in general, is people have this sense of, here's where I want to go, but I am going to be flexible in terms of how I get there. And, what most people end up falling into one of these other two categories, where they have a strong sense of where they're going to go, and then they decide there's only one way for me to get there,
right.
And as a result, their plan collapses and they never get there. Or there are people that are very flexible, but they have no idea where they're going. And so they just kind of wander around endlessly and they have a bunch of different careers. And the key to success is that combination of having that long-term goal and that short-term flexibility. And marriages that are successful will have that, right? The partnership will say, this is ultimately where we want to go, but I'm open to all sorts of things in the intermediate.
Well, you have a big section in there on emotion. And I think a lot of times when we teach leadership, we're primarily warning people, about how emotion can kind of, derail things and get them off track. But you talk about the functional uh, uses of emotion, right? And in particular, how these emotions serve to kind of, I don't know, course correct your plot.
Yeah. So emotion is the smartest thing in your brain. If you're not using your emotions, you're severely limiting your intelligence. And the reason that we know emotion is the smartest thing in the brain is it's the oldest form of intelligence in the brain. So it's been keeping you alive for hundreds of millions of years. And it also remains the most powerful form
And
of emotion.
it all implies some kind of action, right? I mean,
Yes.
emotion always has an action component to it.
100%. Yeah. Well, another way of saying this, right, is if you think something is right, you sometimes do it. But if you feel something is right, you almost always do it. And so emotion is really the driver of our behavior. And so, of course, the question is, well, what's going on with emotion? Because, all of us, if all of us went around just acting angry all the time, that would be very dysfunctional, or all of us went around acting scared all the time, that would be very dysfunctional. But there's still something in there that's intelligent. So what's going on? And so I worked a long time with operators on this, and we particularly worked on fear and anger because those are our two most powerful emotions. Those are our fight or flight response. Fear is flight, and anger is fight. And what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is your brain has a bias to action. Your brain always wants to be doing something. The moment that your brain is sitting still, it feels extremely vulnerable. So it always wants to have a plan. And when your brain experiences a severe threat and it realizes this threat is so new and so different that I don't have a plan, that I have confidence in, I don't know what to do here, that's when your brain starts to feel scared. That's when you feel fear. So the question is why? Why is fear the emotion that your brain evolved? Why didn't it evolve some other emotion, like curiosity or whatever? And the answer is because fear makes you incredibly susceptible to outside influence. The more scared you are, the smarter that other people's suggestions sound. That's why, consultants always sound so smart, because you only call on a consultant when you're really desperate, right? So everything consultant says sounds brilliant, This is why kids who are graduating college suddenly think their parents are so wise, because the kid is panicking about entering the workforce. And so suddenly everything their parents say about, going to medical school or whatever sounds brilliant. So fear exists to make you susceptible.
Now I know why I, threaten all my students with cold calling.
That's right.
It's like,
That's right. Yeah, because it causes that response. Exactly. Yeah. So when you become scared, it means that you become more susceptible to outside plans, which means your brain solves the problem of not having a plan by taking on a plan from your environment. And that's smart in the sense that it's better to have a plan than no plan, but also you can be smarter. And the way that you're smarter is you realize, hey, I'm getting scared right now, and that is signaling to me that I don't have a plan that I believe in. So I've got to figure out a way to get back my initiative. And like we were talking about earlier, that's another way of saying I'm having a failure of initiative right now. What can I do now? What are the kind of brain tricks that I can use to start to get my initiative back? Anger. What's going on with anger? Well, what anger is it's your brain signal that you have one plan and only one plan. And anger evolved in the brain is because what we know is that a plan that's active assertively is more likely to work. So if you do something tentatively, it's less likely to work than if you do it assertively. And so your brain has learned, if I've only got one plan, I better really max out my assertiveness to get really aggressive right now, because this is my one chance to live. Now, again, that's smart, right? It is smart to be assertive when you've only got one plan, but you could also be smarter. And the way you could be smarter is you could say, I've only got one plan that's dangerous, because if I've only got one plan and I acted angrily and it doesn't work, then I'm going to, get into all sorts of problems here with my team and myself. So let me just take a moment, see if I can come up with another plan, a backup plan. And then once I've got that backup plan, go ahead and act aggressively on my initial plan, but know that I can then transition to the backup plan when I need it. And so these are all ways of just understanding that your emotions are signaling to you what's going on in your brain in terms of where your own level of plotting and planning is, and allowing you to be proactive in terms of making your plans, so that instead of just falling into the emotion and allowing it to kind of influence your behavior, you're instead anticipating what the emotion is signaling about your future, so that you can respond to it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the subtitle of your book is "You Are Smarter Than You Know," and I think some people might misinterpret that, and they might think, oh, my emotions are a good guide. I should just listen to them uncritically, right? But I mean, you point out that you need to kind of tune these things. In the part on common sense, you talk about, tuning your anxiety. And so I guess, if you've gone through your whole life and you haven't learned how to tune your anxiety, and you haven't learned how to work with things like fear and anger and how to interpret them correctly, then you might actually be worse off, right?
That's right.
If you have all these years of school and your reason has been fine-tuned and
That's
your
right.
emotions are still in their raw form, then, maybe you're better off ignoring your emotions. I mean,
Well, that's an interesting question. I would actually say you'd be better off learning what your emotions are telling you. And I would also say
Yeah.
you'd probably be better off spending less time in school. So let's talk about anxiety really briefly, because here's a simple example, I think. Because most people in the modern world are always complaining about how anxious they are. And there's this constant thing like, I'm too anxious, I need to get medicated for my anxiety, I need to go meditate, all these kinds of things, And what I learned with working with the operators is no, we're misusing anxiety. The purpose of anxiety is to measure the volatility of our environment. It's to measure the number of unknown unknowns. So when your anxiety is tuned appropriately, you start to get nervous when you realize there are things I don't know that are happening right now. And that means I've got to be really aware so I can start making fast plans and respond to this situation. And so why is it that so many people are experiencing over anxiety in our modern world? Well, the first thing is that too many people spend their time inside these artificially stable environments where they're just not used to anything being unstable. If you spend all your time in the suburbs and, bananas are always there, even in the middle of the winter when you go to the supermarket and whatnot, then you're not ever coping or having to engage with even a mild amount of instability or volatility. So the moment you encounter any of it, you immediately freak out and think that something must be wrong, So that's the first thing is we're conditioning ourselves into this artificial sense of stability, which doesn't allow us to practice using our anxiety productively. The second thing is that most people suffer from over-anxiety because they're looking too far into the future. So the future is the definition of an unknown unknown.
this is a now plus one, right?
This is now plus one, exactly, yeah. And so the further you look into the future, the more your anxiety is always going to spike. I mean, if I asked you, what are you going to do with your investment portfolio in 3 years, right? You can immediately start thinking about all the things that could go on between now and then. And, or if I ask you, what are you going to do, on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday when you're trying to focus on this podcast, you're suddenly going to start thinking about all these obligations you've got to do and all these things, and your anxiety is going to spike. And so the key is you've actually got to be very rigorous and focus your anxiety on the next step ahead. And operators do this all the time. If you're in a combat situation, you can't be focusing on the next day in combat. You can't even be focusing on the next hour. You've got to be focusing on the next minute. And when you do that, all of a sudden you find that your anxiety, instead of spiking, engages very powerfully with your environment, boosts your focus, increases your ability to enter into a flow state. And all of a sudden, all of this brain activity, instead of going around and cascading in non-productive ways, allows you to react and respond faster to your environment, to have greater intuition, to have greater imagination, to have all these greater powers, and to act smarter. And so this is just this key that we don't have. The more time we spend working with technology, the less time we spend understanding our emotions. Technology is designed to be frictionless. That was supposedly the great breakthrough, user design, technology in the early 20th century. So the more time you spend using this frictionless technology, the more you start to think, oh, when I'm having friction, something must be wrong. Therefore, anxiety must be wrong. Therefore, stress must be wrong. And you never actually learn that it's one of the most powerful parts of your intelligence. And so all of these things are things I think we need to start letting back into schools, letting back into business. And we're really in danger right now of raising a generation of students who have no idea how to use most of their natural intelligence.
Well, I want to circle back to how this connects up with narrative intelligence, right? So if you're trying to produce these successful operators, you've described some ways that we could potentially produce an educational environment that would get them to be more effective. To what extent does that require practice with storytelling and listening to stories and exploring stories? And one step further, to what extent does that require the consumption of literature, right? So, at boot camp, we say, okay, everybody down. And, after you've done your 50 push-ups, you got to read 50 sonnets, what's the connection there?
You're not required to do literature in boot camp, but you are required to do stories in boot camp because, again, case studies, that's a story. Me asking you, hey, given this situation, what is your plan? A plan is a plot is a story. So you always want to be doing, and we want to do this. So I do this all the time with my kids. And, I'm sure, this is something that would be very easy to introduce in almost any educational environment, is I say, hey, what is your plan for the day? And then they'll come up with a plan. I say, that's a great plan, except that your mom can't pick you up. What are you going to do because your mom can't pick you up? What's your backup plan? How are you going to solve that? And just forcing young people to start making their own plans. So that is another form of story. You do that. I do that all the same time with my students in college. I say to them, what's your plan for getting this internship? If you don't get that internship, what's your other plan? And then there's almost always just a pause. And then they say, well, I don't know. What do you think I should do? And I say, no, that's not acceptable, right? You've got to come back to me with a plan. And we work with them on how to come up with a plan. And, we always say that, the definition of a plan is you don't know if it's going to work. You've got to get yourself out of the idea that a plan is something that you know is going to work. So the first thing is to your initial question is, yes, there has to be a ton of storytelling or story thinking, as I might call it, just starting to be put back into schools. And that emphasis on that open-ended process of making plots, of making plans, and in response to situations where there isn't a single right way to go. As far as the value of literature, I think we could do a lot better if we start folding some of these stories in. We've created a world now where literature, it's become the equivalent of Wonder Bread or cigarettes or something. It's been driven by this kind of consumer desire for short-term gratification. So we have Disney and we have Harry Potter and we have all these things which are actually not very effective at training the brain up. And if you just want as an individual to train up these parts of your brain, a couple of simple things you can do is start reading memoirs by people who are different from you. Just read a memoir by someone who thinks differently from you. That will immediately grow your brain. And then, go talk to a friend of yours and then ask them for a recommendation for a novel or a film or something. And if you don't like it immediately, keep going. Because what's happening there is they're giving you a story that's different from stories that you understand. And so the more you're able to push through that different novel or that different film and start to engage with it, the more you're growing your brain's narrative capacity. And so I do think that there's an ongoing role for literature in education. But again, it has to be driven by this emphasis on challenge as opposed to, there's a right answer at the end of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how or what to feel, right? Or what to want, if I hadn't consumed a lot of literature, right? Literature it's like a guidebook for life in many ways. But I guess what would a university education look like? Because at the end of the day, I think what we teach is a reflection of the things that we do research on. So it would also require that we sort of change the things that academics do, right? And the kinds of research agendas that we have, right?
Modern education is a disaster. It's a disaster. And AI is revealing the extent of that disaster because AI can come in and do almost all the assignments that are currently being offered by schools. And that tells you right there that you're not engaging all these parts of the brain, like imagination, like intuition, like the ability to make a new plan, any of these kinds of things. And so, just a couple of simple things from my experience. I've already told you that what we're doing in the business school is we're putting students in these open-ended environments where we're saying to them, okay, you want to start this kind of a company. You come to us with a business plan. And then the moment they come to us with that business plan, we start saying, okay, the market changed in this way. There was this fundamental shift. All the satellites that you were planning on, all these telecom satellites, they just went down. We're now in a war in the Pacific, right? How has that changed your business plan? And we start pushing students in these questions. And initially they're like, I don't know what to do. But then the more they run through these exercises, the more like, I would try this, I would try that. And then we push them until they get comfortable responding to environments. And so that's the first thing is I think we need to start seeing college as a way of giving this practice, this space apart from the pressures of the real world, where you have more time to be more imaginative, but you still nevertheless have this pressure on you. What the military calls it is role play with real bullets. In other words, the real stresses, but more time to be imaginative. And then, in terms of how we might teach traditional humanities classes, the way that I teach my classes now, for 20 years now, I've never had a syllabus. And what I always do is I always say to the students, bring in the story that's been most meaningful to you. What movie, what memoir, it doesn't have to be high literature. Bring it in and we're going to break it down. And I'm going to show you things about how it's working that you didn't know. And by doing that, I'm going to prove that I really understand by applying my knowledge to something that I've never seen before.
And you said how it's working, not what it's saying.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So the student will come into me and they'll say, I read this story and it helped me process my grief or something like that, or I read this story and it inspired me to want to start my own business. And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to go through this story and see how it sparked parts of your imagination. And yada, 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 so we do that kind of stuff. And the main thing there is starting to help students understand that they themselves have the freedom to choose the stories that drive their lives. But what we at school can do is help them understand why those stories are having those specific effects so they can become masters of how narratives and how stories work. And I think that this just has to be a shift towards essentially student centering and away from this idea of objective knowledge. If there were objective knowledge, then AI could just win everything, you know? But what makes humans special is our ability to find new answers and to imagine things that haven't been tried before. And so I think we need to start leaning into that direction more and encouraging students to bring in art as a way of creating art, as opposed to bringing in art as a way of writing essays that analyze the art.
Yeah, I can imagine a world where you go into your psychiatrist and you say, you know, I'm experiencing this, and they write a script and says, all right, you got to go read Maya Angelou.
Yes.
You got to go read Winter's Tale or something like that.
Yeah, and one of the things obviously there is, if you're experiencing a severe psychiatric condition, literature alone is not going to be enough to handle it, but literature is definitely enough to get you out of 95% of the situations that I think send people into psychiatrist's office now. A way to think about this is that, a hospital is there to stop disease, but it's not there to help you get healthy. What helps you get healthy is the gym. You can't go to your doctor and have them write a prescription that's suddenly going to make your heart healthier. You know what I mean? If you go there with a severe heart problem, they can have an emergency operation to kind of, clear the arteries, But if you want to actually get your heart healthy, you've got to do the gym. And literature is like the gym. You got to go to the gym. You go to the psychiatrist when you're experiencing a crisis and, you need that sudden intervention. You need the open heart surgery. But the rest of the time, literature is helping you understand your emotions. It's helping you develop a sense of purpose. We haven't talked about that in this conversation, but that's a huge part of human life is just developing a sense of purpose and direction. And that is another way of saying, I need a narrative. I need a story that I'm living, and I need to like my story, and I need to feel that it's personal to me. And literature is great at doing that, because you were talking about how, all this reading helps you develop your own sense of life purpose. You didn't take that life purpose from the stories themselves literally, but in reading them, it made you think, what would I do in that situation? So on and so forth. And what that allowed you to do is develop your own original story through those conversations you were having with the literature. So instead of just taking something from the literature, you're also acting to creating your own path. And I think these are all things that literature can help young people do today.
Well, Angus, you've got some wonderful work here, fascinating stuff. Storythinking, of course, amazing amount of material in a very short book. This new one called Primal Intelligence, and Wonderworks, and this one, Creative Thinking. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.